one question to you is that, because Russia had kind of accepted NATO going to Poland, Baltic states, and so forth, where they have already stationed, was that kind of, I mean, again, not to justify NATO, but that they kind of accepted de facto or de jure the fact that NATO could be there. What is the legal meaning of that, the political, strategic issue of that? Secondly, your thoughts on the proposal for China and African countries and Brazil for peace, and whether I know NATO has kind of flatly rejected that, and what does that say? So, wanted to get your thoughts, and thank you, Norm, for everything that you do.
I cannot speak with authority about why Russia was willing to acquiesce in a NATO presence in Poland and Romania, but not a NATO presence in Georgia and Ukraine. My understanding, but I have always to acknowledge my complete ignorance of military matters, my understanding is Ukraine posed a kind of military threat to Russia that the other countries did not. But I'm not going to get into an argument because I don't have enough knowledge in that matter. What I would say is Russia made clear that the red lines were Ukraine and Georgia. They made that clear from 2007. I guess it was Putin's speech in Munich, that those would be red lines. I would guess, but I can't prove it, that those red lines were not artificially selected, that there was a reason why those were the red lines. And I would also say there is no question that Russia had economic concerns when it came to Ukraine. And there was a whole conflict going back to 2014, whether Ukraine, that was under Yevtushenko, whether Ukraine would sign an economic agreement with a European trade pact, or whether it would sign an agreement with a Russian trade pact. And it's true, both sides put an enormous amount of pressure on Ukraine to sign with either one or the other. And it was the European side that was emphatic that you can't belong to both pacts. You have to choose whether you will belong to the EU, effectively the European Union Pact. It was called I can't remember, something agreement, it'll come back to me. You have to choose. So I'm not going to deny that Russia had a strong economic interest in Ukraine. But what I would say is countries are always using their economic clout to impose different kinds of agreements, economic agreements. That's what, as Tanwir can tell you, that's what the IMF does every day. It imposes these agreements, structural adjustment they're called, and they put very onerous requirements on countries in order to get an IMF loan. That's the way the world system works. But there's a big difference between, as much as I deplore the imposition of economic pressures on weaker economies. There's a big difference between that and going to war. And I do not believe Russia had any desire or intent to go to war over an economic issue. But when it saw, I don't like to use the word, its security was at stake, because every government obviously makes all sorts of security claims, and most of them on close inspection proved to be spurious. However, in my opinion, the matter could easily have been resolved without any impingement whatsoever, none. No infringement whatsoever on Ukrainian sovereignty. Because this was not a Ukrainian sovereignty issue. It was a NATO issue. NATO could simply have said, Ukraine presents its request to join NATO. NATO could simply have said, we're not accepting your request. That doesn't impinge on Ukraine's sovereignty. They're allowed to say no. Now, NATO says it had an open invitation, anyone can join. Yes, that's true. And NATO has the right to say, but we're going to make an exception here. It was simple as that. The other issue was the autonomy in the Donbass in eastern Ukraine. The reasonable fears of the people in East Ukraine that a government filled, especially at the military and security level, with very right-wing elements that were fanatically anti-Russian, that they had a reasonable fear that their security and their cultural autonomy was in jeopardy. And an agreement was reached. It's called, the technical term is Minsk II. An agreement was reached, and there doesn't seem, as far as I could tell, there doesn't seem to be any dispute whatsoever at this point that it was the Ukrainian government that killed that Minsk II agreement of, I think it was February 2015, which would have granted the Russian-speaking people in eastern Ukraine some local autonomy in cultural matters and also in other political matters.